Well, hello. Okay, we're going to start chapter 25, which really covers fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. Now, the interesting thing about this is it's sort of like seems like a grab bag of different topics, but really what it is showing you uh, physiological interactive systems, which is a fancy way of saying how these different systems work to achieve homeostasis when it comes to fluid, electrolytes, and acid-base balance. So let's move forward with this. When we look at the body composition, it can be viewed in terms of solids and two fluid compartments. The extracellular fluid compartment, which is ECF. This is fluid from the interstitial tissues, both the peripheral tissues and the plasma from the circulating blood. But it will also include lymph, cerebrospinal fluids, synovial fluids, serous fluids, aqueous humor, such as in the eye, the perilymph, and the endolymph. Now, intracellular fluid, ICF. This is fluid from the cytosol of all cells. The fluid compartments consist of ICF and ECF. Each maintain their unique ionic compositions. So what we're saying, and one of the simple examples is look at, if you remember in chapter, in your AP1 on the sensory systems, perilymph and endolymph are very different and they cannot mix for the function of the cochlea, all right, and the sense of hearing structure. They have different ionic compositions, etc. And if they are to mix, you lose the capability of the sense of hearing. Now, if you see these, you can see the differences between adult males and adult females. How about the solids, which really include both organic and inorganic materials? The plasma quantities, and the interstitial fluid, which make up basically the extracellular fluid, ECF, as well as the ICF, which is the intracellular fluid. When we look at the solid components, we go through proteins, lipids, minerals, carbohydrates, and miscellaneous. Now, fluid balance exists when water gains equal the water loss. Makes sense? Fluid balance when the body water content remains stable over a period of time. So this is something that's basically managed throughout time. And when you have severe fluid shifts, this can cause life-threatening situations. But let's just go over some of the basics here. A fluid shift is a rapid water movement between ECF and ICF in response to an osmotic gradient. Okay, now these will occur rapidly in response to changes in osmotic concentration of the ECF and reach equilibrium within minutes or hours. Now, it's important when water intake is restricted but water losses are severe. Case in point, you have someone who's out working out in a hot sunny day. They lose a lot of water. We would normally consider that dehydration, which occurs when water losses outpace water gains. What you have to keep in mind is that there's a difference now. When you lose water, the solutes are still retained. For example, electrolytes. And this osmotic concentration can really cause some difficulty in functioning. For example, if you lose a lot of water, you start having the blood getting somewhat sluggish if you don't replace the water. Because if you think about what blood is, it's not just plasma. It's the formed elements, the red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, as well as the plasma proteins and the ions and everything else. So what can happen when you start having losses? The solute concentration increases, loss of water. I mean, what's a solution? It's solutes and solvent. Well, if the water is the solvent, then the solute concentration will go up if the solvent, the water, is lost. Okay? Now, when we have dehydration, this is serious because it can lead to decreases in blood volume, blood pressure, and eventually we can face circulatory shock. Okay? Now, if you take a look at the fluid balance here, To save time, to save you from losing sleep, you do not have to completely memorize all the numbers. Get a general idea about what the input and the output are occurring. Excuse me. For example, you have your input of water content of food, water consumed as a liquid, metabolic water produced during catabolism. Okay, so it's about 2,500 milliliters. And how do we have elimination? Well, urination, evaporation at skin, evaporation at lungs, and the loss in feces. Again, about 2,500 milliliters. So it's a nice balance there. Keep in mind that situations can occur where you won't have that balance. Okay. Excuse me. And of course, this diagram here shows you, dietary intake, digestive secretions, because this is the part where we get into the need for a large colon, for a large intestine, because we've got to reabsorb the liquid that we put into the digestive process from saliva, gastric secretions, the liver, the pancreas, intestinal secretions, etc. We have to recover that water. So we have the small intestine reabsorbing some and the colon reabsorbing others. So we really lose very little, about 150 mils in feces. Okay. And here's a nice diagram keeping you a clear understanding of ECF, ICF chambers, water absorbed across the digestive epithelium, water lost in urine, water secreted by sweat glands. Now, this is variable. This is one of the bigger variabilities that can occur depending on temperature, depending on activity, etc. Water vapor loss at skin and lungs, a certain amount. Water loss in feces, usually very small amount. So where would we have problems here in these fluid chambers? Well, for one thing, if we had to secrete a lot more water in sweat glands, that's one way you can have dehydration. And we'll mention this briefly. I may have mentioned it before, but diabetes insipidus, in other words, individuals who have no antidiuretic hormone presented, and so they're constantly producing a large amount of dilute urine, which means they're going to increase their loss of water, and they have to replace it all the time. Now, keep in mind you can see where these ICF and ECF chambers are. If you end up having water loss from the ECF, this is the situation that you're going to have. You're going to have transference from ICF to ECF. Now, if you're getting that kind of mixed up, think about it this way. If my plasma goes down, if my extracellular fluid goes down, you're going to have a migration of water out from the cells. But when you have that migration occurring, you're going to alter the solute concentration inside the cells, which may eventually, under certain circumstances, without replacement of the water, alter the biochemical makeup of those cells. Okay. Now, we're going to move into mineral balance. This involves balancing electrolyte gain and loss. Minerals are basically inorganic substances, and when you think about it, yes, sodium chloride. Okay, so sodium ions, chloride ions, potassium chloride, magnesium chloride, calcium chloride, and we can go on and on and on, bicarbonate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, now, electrolytes are ions released when mineral salts dissociate. Okay. Mineral balance exists when ion absorption and excretion are about the same. Really? Okay. And most of you are still scratching your head going, so what's the big deal here? The big deal is that you can have imbalances of electrolytes and you can have imbalances of ion absorption or ion excretion. Now, before I get into the next couple of examples in this slide, let me give you an example of an electrolyte imbalance. If you recall in your digestive chapter, we talked about bulimia, individuals who basically have, through psychological means, etc., they will consume lots of food, they'll binge and then purge. Now, when they're purging, you have to understand something. They don't just lose the food that they had previously consumed. They lose a lot of electrolytes in the form of hydrogen ions, chloride ions, etc. This is where they can get into electrolyte imbalances. Someone that has a profound case of certain diarrhea-related diseases where they vomit up a lot or they have a lot of diarrhea, so they lose a lot of sodium, potassium, chloride, etc. They can start having imbalances that will actually affect nerve conduction, may cause muscle cramps, etc. It may actually affect even cardiac function. Okay, so having a proper balance of electrolytes is absolutely essential. Now, let me give you a couple of pointers here. Oral rehydration therapy story. Um, one of the problems that occurred in the 1900s, to a point, even in this century, it still exists, is diarrhea diseases, especially in developing countries. In some cases, diarrhea diseases, cholera, things like that, they will really kill off a lot of kids that are under the age of 5. And what happened was some scientists got together, particularly from World Health Organization, et cetera, and they said, how can we give a rehydration therapy to these kids that are dying literally because either they vomit it up or they pass it out in vast amounts of diarrhea and they lose the electrolytes, they lose the water quickly. And within a few days, you can see you could pinch the skin, and instead of it reflexing, it becomes sort of a mound there. They call it tenting. And what's going on is they have severe dehydration, which will lead inevitably to a spiraling down to, unfortunately, death. What they did was come up with a packet that contained sugar and salts, and they were going to distribute these packets, but then they sat there and they said, wait a minute, these packets cost about 50 cents a piece. You want to get them out to villages that need them. And these people there, basically 50 cents would basically take care of almost the whole village for a year. Not the amount of the therapeutic rehydration material, but they basically don't even earn 50 cents, the whole village. They're in extreme poverty. So what they decided to do was another application. They took and they started an education campaign, and they basically would teach the villagers all over the place, whether it's in southern Asia or in Africa or in other places. Basically, you take water, even if it's dirty water, and you take 5 large handfuls of sugar and 5 small pinches of salt. Mix it up, okay? And this is the large and the salt. And that mixture can be fed to the infants, and they'll survive through the diarrhea attack, okay, whether it's cholera, etc. Because eventually, what the gastrointestinal system will do is try to purge out the pathogen. But what you've got to do is basically keep hydration present for these infants so they can fight off the disease. So that's the 5 and 5, 5 sugar large and 5 small salt. Now, this leads us almost into the Gatorade story. Now, Gatorade, you probably have heard in all the different colors and all the different, there's diet and there's zero and all this other stuff. Well, let's get back to basics. This formulation was developed in 1965 by a team of researchers at University of Florida. This was led by Dr. Robert Cade, and Cade himself was a physiologist. He was also a nephrologist. In other words, he knew kidney physiology. And it was originally made for the Florida Gators at the University of Florida to replenish the carbohydrates that the school's student athletes burned up. Now, remember something, if you're not familiar, if you're wearing heavy equipment for football and you're playing, it is not nice and cool at 30 degrees. It's still probably 70 or 80. I've got friends and relatives down in Florida. They'll tell you, man, it's warm today. Well, if they're playing for just August, it's hot. They're going to sweat. They're going to face heat stroke and they're going to lose a lot of strength because they're losing the carbohydrates and the electrolytes. So they made a combination of water and electrolytes, and they would make that to help compensate for what the athletes lost in sweat during the rigorous sports activities. And eventually it became a winning formula. It helped the athletes withstand even the last quarter. And eventually it was credited for why they were winning. And then a company came and bought them, and eventually another company came and bought the formula and bought the formula. And basically, University of Florida has done very, very well from the royalties for Gatorade. Now, let me throw this out to you if you really want to know. The basic formula was sugar and water and some citric acid and some uh, different electrolytes. It's always the sugar because they found that the glucose in the sugar will help transport the ions. This is where we get into symport transporters and carriers across the cell membranes. They will help with the rehydration because it's not just rehydration with replacement of water, but you have to replace the electrolytes. I hope that helps you. Okay, let's move on. Here they just bring up the concept of ion absorption, and this occurs across the epithelial lining of the small intestine and colon. You will have some reserves, primarily in the skeleton, but that's mostly, calcium and phosphate. You will have an ion pool in the body fluids, both ECF and ICF, but then we lose them. And the modes of loss are primarily through sweat gland secretions, as well as the kidneys. Okay? Now, before you get bananas and sit there and go, oh my gosh, you asked us to memorize all of this. No, okay. You should be able to easily identify sodium, calcium, potassium, chloride. Okay. The key point is that those are the biggies when it comes to electrolytes. But electrolytes in solutions will not only carry what I would call the mega mineral quantities, but they will also take the smaller ones like iodide and iron and bicarbonate and nitrate and phosphate and sulfate, etc. Okay? It helps to review this because when you're confronted with a situation where you have to deal with somebody who has dehydration, what are you going to do? Okay? Now, this is just to give you an idea. Again, you don't have to memorize any numbers. You want to just see where the primary route of excretion is, these bulk minerals and the trace minerals, and how we get them, and what roles they play in certain functions physiologically. Okay? Now, water balance depends on sodium balance, and the two are regulated simultaneously. I'm going to have you try to remember this. Water follows sodium. Therefore, you have a loss of sodium, you have a loss of ECF volume, and that means that the water is going to leave also. So if you gain sodium, you will gain water. Okay? Now, here's the deal. What's the difference between sodium and potassium? As I mentioned to you before, potassium was so abundant if we go back to our ancient ancestors that from an evolutionary perspective, it didn't matter if you lost a lot of potassium because you were consuming a lot. Fruits, vegetables, all sorts of different matter. Sodium, on the other hand, was not as freely available, and therefore it was to an evolutionary advantage to find ways to retain sodium. Now, response to changes in sodium levels, we have to keep in mind that we have a sodium balance. So, in other words, when you have sodium gains, that has to equal the sodium losses. This is where we get into the response to changes in ECF volume. Now, before you sit there and go, but what about ICF? Remember, sodium is in excess. It is in greater concentration outside of the cell than inside the cell. Potassium is the other way around. If you remember, that's how neurons function. Okay, sodium is on the outside, rushes in when you have a action potential. Okay, so when we look at this and we note the homeostasis of it all, we have a response to changes in ECF volume. And If you have hyponatremia, natri and ATRE, that gives you the hint it refers to sodium. Okay? Hyponatremia, natremia is a low sodium content in the ECF. We're talking about below 136 milliequivalents per liter. This can be detected by a normal blood test because ECF includes not only the interstitial fluid outside the cells, but it also includes, of course, the plasma in the blood. Usually when you have hyponatremia, it's due to excessive water intake, overhydration, or inadequate salt intake. How do you have inadequate salt intake? It can happen. Let me just give you one other pointer. Now, excessive water intake, there were a couple of radio shock jocks some years back that did this almost incredibly unbelievable thing. This is when the Wii, W-I-I, that new electronic game device was out. And so these guys did a contest where hold your Wii, your P for Wii. And if you did for an excessive amount of time, then basically you won a Wii platform. Well, unfortunately, it backfired on them. And the person that was saying, look, I can barely hold on, da, 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 da. And then they just called up for the yucks, a nurse, and the nurse said, "You got to get that lady to the doctor quickly. She could die," and she did. Sadly, she did die. And of course, her family sued the radio station, and the shock jocks had to apologize and all that other stuff. But anyways, now we've talked about hyponatremia. There's hypernatremia, high sodium content of the ECF. The concentration exceeds 145 milliequivalents per liter. Usually, if someone has this is due to dehydration. So they lose a lot of water, as I said, but the sodium will still be in the tissues, and its solute concentration will be elevated as a result. Now, here's the situation. To attain homeostasis, if you have increasing sodium levels in the ECF, you can see the process from receptors being activated in the hypothalamus, ADH secretion increases, and what you have is basically a means to restore the sodium levels in the ECF by increasing water intake, and this should decrease the sodium concentration. Now, if you have homeostasis disturbed by decreasing sodium levels in the ECF, what you would have are basically, again, osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, they're being inhibited. ADH secretion decreases. So it's going to act on the kidneys. Thirst is suppressed, you're going to increase the water loss, and so the water loss will achieve a proper osmolarity, where the sodium ions have a certain concentration compared to the water that is in the ECF. Now, what about normal ECF volume? Now, this is a little different, okay? Keep in mind, before we were talking about sodium concentration. But if we talk about normal volume, if the volume is increasing by fluid gain, and that can be fluid or sodium or both, you're going to have a stressing on the cardiac muscle cells, which will cause a release of natriuretic peptides. These will act on the hypothalamus, the kidney, and the blood vessels. The basic line there is you're going to increase sodium excretion in the urine. You're going to also increase water loss in the urine. You're going to have a reduced thirst. You're going to have inhibition of a variety of hormones, ADH, aldosterone, epinephrine, norepinephrine. You will have peripheral vasodilation, so the blood pressure is going to decrease, and the ECF volume will decrease, going back to a normal homeostasis. If you had a decreasing ECF volume by fluid loss, what you could have, and this can be, for example, because of fluid loss or sodium loss, or both, the receptors, the baroreceptors in the kidneys, you're going to get sympathetic activation. You're going to get the effectors of the hypothalamus and heart and blood vessel. What's going to happen there? You're going to get eventually an increase in aldosterone release. you're going to basically retain sodium. So that means a decrease of sodium loss in the urine, a decrease of water loss in the urine, an increased thirst. So that's going to be a behavioral response, a reflex, if you wanted to call it that. That's going to kick in and you're going to be drinking more water, and an increase in cardiovascular output and peripheral vasoconstriction. So pushing up the blood pressure. Now, let's move into potassium. One, because it's very uncommon, but they can be extremely dangerous when you have disturbances of a potassium balance. And again, the balance is basically potassium loss versus intake. The key factors here are that the potassium entry across the digestive epithelium and the rate of potassium loss in the urine. Now, keep in mind, potassium you can lose, but you're going to balance that with what you take in, whether it's a banana, whether it's tomato or tomato sauce or anything else. Anything with fruits and vegetables right off the bat are going to have certain amount of potassium, but you can get that from other foods too. Then we deal with the terms of excessiveness or under a certain ion concentration. Hypokalemia, the kalemia part refers to potassium. In this, you have blood potassium ion concentration. It falls below 2 milliequivalents per liter. Okay, so it's a concentration measure. And this will be demonstrated by extreme muscle weakness, extreme paralysis. Now, keep in mind that what is potassium? It's going to be involved with action potentials. So you're going to have diminished action potentials and therefore skeletal muscle weakness. Also, you will eventually have paralysis. Now, this can eventually lead to a disruption of heart function. It can be leading to heart failure. This situation can increase the risk of an abnormal heart rhythm, which is often too slow and can cause cardiac arrest. So that's hypokalemia. But hyperkalemia, this is where the blood potassium ion concentrations exceed 7 milliequivalents per liter. A situation like this is going to result in cardiac arrhythmias, instability there. Now, there's other situation that can cause problems with potassium, and that's aldosteronism. Excessive aldosterone production or secretion, that's the hormone that's released in the adrenal glands. This results in hypokalemia by overstimulating sodium retention and potassium loss. Now, here's one other thing to keep in mind. If dietary adjustments can help treat hypokalemia and hyperkalemia, great. But if they can't, and particularly if you've got renal failure, then kidney dialysis may be required in a situation like this. So if you take a look here, you've got the distal convoluted tubule here. The primary mechanism of potassium secretion involves an exchange pump. You take in sodium. It goes eventually all the way through to the ECF. Potassium is brought in from the ECF and eventually gets put into the tubular fluid, which means it's going to be excreted. Now, the aldosterone exchange pump here means that aldosterone will kick this up and keep it active. So this is one of the few hormone-controlled antiport ion exchange pumps that you have. Okay, there are a few others. This one here is a simple sodium potassium pump. So you're moving from the extracellular fluid right into the tubular fluid. Now, notice that not only do you have an aldosterone sensitive pump exchanging the potassium for the sodium in the tubular fluid, but it will also do such in the collecting duct. But here in the collecting duct, instead, you're not exchanging sodium and potassium, you're exchanging sodium, got to be the same charge ion here, and hydrogen ions, okay? If the concentration of hydrogen ions is relatively high, you're going to have the exchange pump bind hydrogen instead of potassium, and this is going to help stabilize the pH of the ECF. But you're going to end up having a cost of increasing the potassium levels in the ECF as well, okay? Now, factors controlling the potassium balance, you can see these and review these. But I really want you to keep in mind that potassium what goes in, you have to balance with what is being excreted. If you have a fairly decent balance, fine. If one does not have this balance, you are facing either hyperkalemia or hypokalemia, depending on which way the situation is going. Now, from here, we're going to move into, we've moved from fluid to electrolyte, and now we're going to move into acid-base balance. There are three categories of acids in the body, okay? And when we talk acid-base balance, this is the production of hydrogen ions is offset by their loss, and when the pH of the body fluids remains in a normal limit. Remember, normal limit for blood, the normal pH range is 7.35 to 7.45. Yeah, that number you're going to have to memorize, 7.35 to 7.45, okay? And I can guarantee you, you'll probably see that on an NCLEX exam or a medical license board. Believe me, that is a normal range, and you've got to know what it is and when you go outside of that and the consequences. Now, remember how I started off this chapter? I said, you know, you're going to have different systems playing a role in the function of the balance of the fluid, the electrolyte, the acid base. Well, here we are. Here we are. The respiratory system and the urinary system, they're going to play a role in working with the buffer systems in the ECF and ICF to basically maintain this homeostatic balance of pH. Now, when we talk about acids, I don't want you to think of something like, you know, if I drip some of this solution over, it's going to dissolve everything. But rather, there are several different types or groups of acids that we've got to be aware of that can cause minor shifts or major shifts depending on whether buffers are present or not. When we talk about fixed acids, these don't leave the solution once produced. They remain in body fluids until eliminated by the kidneys. Now, phosphoric acid and sulfuric acid are produced. Now, keep in mind, very small amounts. This is usually by catabolism of amino acids. So what do I mean by that? Let's just take that and step back a minute. Several amino acids contain sulfur. So if they're being broken down, catabolized, okay, you're going to have that sulfur, and it can be leading up into the formation of very minute quantities of sulfuric acid. You also have phosphate groups that can be cleaved off when you break down nucleic acids or phospholipids, okay? Those can lead to the formation of phosphoric acids. Then we have metabolic acids. These take part or are produced by cellular metabolism. So if you remember the chapter we did on metabolic metabolism, you have pyruvic acid and lactic acid and ketone bodies, and all of these can have an influence on pH. But one of the things you have to keep in mind is that some of them are going to be inside the cell. Pyruvic acid is an example. But pyruvic acid, lactic acid, these can be also secreted into the blood, which means going into the ECF. And usually most of these are metabolized very quickly, so there's no significant real accumulations of these, unless you have certain diseases. Diabetes mellitus, for example, can show up with one of its impacts is the tissue will start metabolizing more lipids, and henceforth you will start having the production of ketone bodies that'll show up in the blood and actually can show up in the breath. Acetone, for example. Now, volatile acids. These enter and leave the body and enter the atmosphere via the lungs. So what am I talking about here? Real simple. Water plus carbon dioxide forms carbonic acid. Okay? Remember that? We wrote it down on the board and everything else. And then when you have carbonic acid, that can get dissociated to hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. Okay? So this is where you're going to have active tissue cells, respiratory system, and the kidneys all contributing various types of influences onto blood pH. The buffer systems can act to temporarily store the hydrogen ions and thereby provide short-term pH stability. We're going to get into this. We talked about the hypokalemia, we talked about hyperkalemia before. Well, we're going to move forward with this. This is where it gets really interesting. because what you have to understand is that potentially dangerous disturbances in acid-base balances are opposed by the buffer systems. If it's not for the buffer systems, everything falls to pieces. There we are again, that normal pH range, 7.35 to 7.45. Okay, so let's talk about this. If we have the pH of the blood decrease below 7.35, that's called acidemia. The physiological state of acidemia is called acidosis. Alkalemia is the pH of the blood exceeding the pH of 7.45. Alkalosis is the physiological state of alkalemia. Now, keep in mind that acids changes in pH can influence structure and function of proteins. They can interfere with the functions of enzymes, thereby affect the metabolism of the cell. They can also affect the transport of proteins and the structure of proteins in plasma. This is just a couple of examples right off the bat. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a couple of things, the buffer system, but we're going to talk about also very briefly, I'm going to come back to that, carbonic acid. It's formed from carbon dioxide and water. Now, there is a key enzyme. Yes, you need to know this, okay? Carbonic anhydrase. Now, what it will do is accelerate the conversion from CO2 and water to carbonic acid. But see, carbonic acid is really unstable. It breaks down basically to hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. Now, if you have a rush of excess hydrogen ions there, that's going to cause the hydrogen ions to bind with the bicarbonate ion to form more carbonic acid, because this reaction is reversible. It's reversible from carbon dioxide and water to carbonic acid, and it's reversible from carbonic acid to hydrogen ion, bicarbonate ion, and back to carbonic acid, okay? This is where the book mentions it results in an inverse relationship between the partial pressure of CO2 and pH. What does that mean? Inverse is opposite, okay? So what I'm saying is this: if my PCO2 goes up, my pH will go down. If my PCO2 goes down, my pH will go up. Remember that as the numbers get less and less in pH, that means you're becoming more acidic, okay? So, buffer systems. These are systems that oppose changes in pH in body fluids. They usually consist of a combination of a weak acid and an ion. The anion basically functions as a weak base. So we've seen the categories of acids: fixed, metabolic, volatile acids. I encourage you to take time to review these terms. Actually, you probably are fairly familiar with them, should be, because you had these in A&P 1, as well as your chemistry, okay? Keep in mind that here we have that narrow range, 7.35 to 7.45. So if you go below that, you're going to have acidemia, and the physiological state is called acidosis. If you go above 7.45, you're going to have alkalemia, and the physiological state is alkalosis. Okay? Now, how do we obtain homeostasis to stay at a pH of 7.35 to 7.45? And basically at the same time, a partial pressure of CO2 between 35 and 45. Okay, real simple. If I have the numbers go basically in a direction where I have an increasing partial CO2, I'm going to shift. The water and the CO2 will form by carbonic acid. And these will generate more hydrogen ions, the bicarbonate ions. So as you have an increase in PCO2, you have a decrease in the pH. Now what happens, and this is if I'm having an increase in partial CO2. What if I had a decreasing amount of partial pressure of CO2? Well, interestingly enough, with declines in PCO2, one of the things that can happen is my pH will go up. Well, how does that happen? Remember that hydrogen that would have played a role in influencing the pH will bind with the bicarbonate ion, forming carbonic acid, which will immediately start to dissociate into just water and carbon dioxide. Now, this is the cool part. Buffer systems can delay, but usually will not prevent pH shifts in ICF and ECF. They can delay it because what buffers do is they blunt the pH shifts, so it's not so severe, but they can still eventually succumb as if you have concentrations of ions of hydrogen, for example, increasing tremendously due to some physiological abnormalities, otherwise known as disease, or if you have less and less of carbon dioxide present, and so the pH shifts toward alkalosis. We'll get more into that in a few minutes. You have to keep in mind that there are three major buffer systems in the body. The first one is the phosphate buffer system. It's important in buffering the pH of ICF and urine. Okay. Now, the second one is the protein buffer system, which contributes to the regulation of the pH in both ECF and ICF. This is the interesting thing. This particular system, which consists of three major components, really interacts with the other two buffering systems, the phosphate and the carbonic acid one. The protein buffer system consists of the following. You've got one of them that you'd see in all red blood cells. It's the hemoglobin buffer system. The next one is the amino acid buffers, and you're going to see that in all proteins. And finally, the plasma protein buffers. And then finally, the last buffering system is carbonic acid to bicarbonate buffer system. But that you'd see much more prominently in ECF, okay? Now, you're going to have situations where you're going to face metabolic acid-base disorders. And then you're also going to face other situations where you're going to have respiratory acid-base disorders, okay? Metabolic result from the production or loss of excessive amounts of fixed or metabolic acids. Carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system's role is to protect against these disorders. The respiratory acid-base disorders, these result from an imbalance between the rate of CO2 generated and the rate of CO2 eliminated. Okay, now here's the part that you need to keep in mind. With respiratory acid-base disorders, the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer cannot correct this disorder. The only way that you can really get any changes are reflexive changes in depth and rate of respiration. In other words, if I'm building up CO2, you would think this, okay, in my blood, the better thing to do is I'm going to increase my respiration rate to vent off the CO2. So it's going to be respiratory. Metabolic is a little bit different. That's situations that occur because of excessive amounts of fixed or metabolic acids, okay? Now, here we talked about buffering systems, intracellular fluid, phosphate buffering system, but also what plays a role is the protein buffering systems, which kind of basically span the gap between ICF and ECF. They can work at both, all right? And there's three different types of the protein buffer systems: the hemoglobin buffer system, the amino acid buffer system, and the plasma protein buffers. Then we have the extracellular fluid, and you also have the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. Here's the first part so that you don't get lost. First off, tissue cells, if they're metabolically active, are going to produce carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide meets with water in the plasma. It will become carbonic acid inside the cell. The cell will also break this into bicarbonate, and then the hemoglobin will bind the hydrogen. Great. Once we get to the lungs, we're going to basically recombine the hydrogen ion and the bicarbonate ion to form carbonic acid, which will freely come and pass out of the cell, the red blood cell. You will have water, and you will have CO2, which will pass across the respiratory membrane, and it will be released with exhalation. Okay? Now, how do all these proteins, amino acids play a role in neutralizing hydrogen ions? Okay, here's the basics. Now, remember that with any amino acid, you're going to have an amine group, our carboxylic acid group. You have a nice central carbon here. You got a little hydrogen off on here, and it's the R group. That's the group that really differentiates one amino acid from another. You know, some of them might be just hydrogen. They might be long chains of hydrocarbons. They could be sulfur, etc. Just keep that in mind. Now, notice that at the normal pH range, this oxygen right down here is all alone. It doesn't have a hydrogen, which would normally do. That's why it's charged. So it's negatively charged. And so what happens is as you have a decreasing pH, which means an increasing acidity, you can have the amino acid absorb that hydrogen. It will also absorb another hydrogen. And so what you have is the possibility of having several hydrogens here. One of them will lead to a positive charge. You could also have the R group absorb another hydrogen if the chain allows for that, or the R group allows for that. Okay, so this is why it's so incredible. When you think about it, hemoglobin, what's the chains of hemoglobin made up of? Protein, amino acids. There are a lot of other proteins that are in blood. They're going to basically be made up of amino acids, and they're going to basically act as a mop to pull in hydrogen ions when there's an excess. Okay? Remember, they can blunt the changes, but they can't stop everything. This is where we get into the addition of hydrogens from metabolic activity. Okay, fine. You can have the carbonic acid system here to help with metabolic activity. Okay? But keep in mind that with lots and lots of CO2, the only way really, if it's just basically a respiratory acidosis, you have to increase the breathing rate. Okay? So really what we're doing is we're moving into this section that is broken off into metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, and then subsequently in another couple of slides we'll have respiratory acidosis alkalosis. Now for all of you happy campers out there, you got to keep this in mind. You need to know this because no matter what form of medicine, allied health, or whatever, you're going to deal with patients who have the metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. You will have other cases of respiratory acidosis alkalosis. Okay, so let's start off. We talk about the homeostatic responses to metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. They're involved with respiratory and renal mechanisms, as well as the buffer systems. Metabolic acidosis develops when large numbers of hydrogen ions are released by metabolic or fixed acids, and the pH decreases. Okay. Now, metabolic alkalosis. This develops when large numbers of hydrogen ions are removed from the body fluids, resulting in increases in the pH. Can that happen? Yeah. You had people that would be in Olympic events, so they wouldn't have the buildup of lactic acid in their blood. They would take large amounts of bicarbonate, sodium bicarbonate, as a matter of fact. And that would shift their pH of their blood. It might give them the extra oomph to make the race, but afterwards could also be deleterious to their health. Let's go over this one step at a time. What are the responses to metabolic acidosis, both respiratory and renal? Well, for respiratory, you're going to have an increased respiratory rate, and this is going to decrease the partial pressure of CO2. Carbonic acid molecules will revert to water, and the CO2 will basically be breathed out. The renal response is going to be that the kidney tubules will secrete hydrogen ions. They'll remove CO2, they'll reabsorb bicarbonate ions to help replenish the bicarbonate reserves. Remember, you're trying to oppose the drop in pH, so bicarbonate is what you want to retain. Now, what are the responses to metabolic alkalosis? The respiratory response is decreased respiratory rate. This is going to increase the partial CO2 pressure. It will convert CO2 molecules to carbonic acid. okay? You want to keep the pH and start turning it back from being outside the 7.45 range and back down. Well, the other way also to do it is the renal response, which is the kidney tubules will respond by conserving hydrogen ions. They will secrete bicarbonate ions. So the bicarbonate will be excreted. The hydrogen ions will be returned back to the ECF outside of the tubules. And you can see how this response occurs. Now, this is all metabolic, so keep this in mind, okay? The kidney responds to acidosis, the respiratory responds to acidosis, and you can see here at the DCT, the distal convoluted tubule, that what you're getting now is this step in the hydrogen removal and the bicarbonate production, okay? Now, of course, when you have the response to the alkalosis, again, it's metabolic. What are you going to have? You're going to have the kidneys, they're going to respond by conserving hydrogen ions and secreting, getting rid of the bicarbonate. Okay. Now, you'll see this at the ECT, what's going to happen. Let's kick out the hydrogens, keep the hydrogens here. We're going to take CO2 out of the tubular fluid. We're going to basically make the carbonic acid. It's going to dissociate. You're going to excrete the bicarbonate, but you're going to keep the hydrogen ions. And they're going to be transported out, and usually accompanied by the diffusion of chloride ions. This is going to start bringing the ECF back into the normal range. So it's going to go below the 7.45, okay? Now we deal with respiratory acid-base disorders. They're the most common challenges to the acid-base balance, but keep in mind several other things that are unique here. When we talk about respiratory acid-base disorders, they result from an imbalance between the rate of CO2 generation in the body tissues and the rate of CO2 elimination by the lungs. So here's the problem. They can't be corrected by carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer systems. They can be compensated in part by other buffer systems, but carbonic acid bicarbonate, not going to play a role at all. Can't do it. So let's talk about respiratory acidosis. You have the rate of CO2 generation exceeds the rate of CO2 removal. What's the respiratory response? You have an increased respiratory rate. You're breathing faster, you're breathing deeper, trying to get the CO2 out. What's the renal response? Well, the kidneys are going to secrete hydrogen ions. They're going to generate bicarbonate ions, okay? The other buffer systems will accept the hydrogen ions to help mop it up and try to bring the pH back into balance. What about respiratory alkalosis? Now, this is uncommon and rarely severe. Very rarely do you see this. This is where the rate of CO2 elimination exceeds the rate of CO2 generation. The respiratory response is decreased respiratory rate. The renal response is that the kidneys will generate hydrogen ions and secrete bicarbonate ions. Again, you will have other buffer systems releasing hydrogen ions. So basically what you want to do is bring it up from that alkalosis and start bringing it back down to 7.45 or even a little bit lower than that. Keep it in that range. And the book notes very articulately what's one of the major means for treatment here? Breathing into a paper bag. You get somebody, you give them a paper bag, they breathe in, out, breathe in, out. They're recycling the air. So the purpose is that as they keep reusing that same air, they're going to breathe back in some of that CO2 that was breathed out and keep moving the CO2 into the blood to help bring back the pH of the blood into that 7.35, 7.45 range. Here is how we achieve homeostasis here. Homeostasis disturbed by increasing PCO2. Obviously, you're going to see the mechanisms that are going to increase the respiratory rate. The kidneys are going to secrete hydrogen and generate the bicarbonate, and buffer systems, not the bicarbonate acid, the carbonic acid bicarbonate systems, but the other ones will accept hydrogens. You will see eventually a decline in the PCO2, a decreased hydrogen ion presence and an increased bicarbonate ion presence, and the blood pH will begin to turn to normal. If you have this where, because of hyperventilation, you have some people, they get into a panic and they start breathing rapidly, then what's going to happen? Well, they may pass out. Okay, they're hyperventilating. That's when you get them to hyperventilate into the paper bag so they can start bringing back the CO2 and start reestablishing the blood pH and the PCO2 back to normal range. Okay, so we have completed the chapter. You want to peruse the chapter review. That's on pages 993 and 994. You want to complete the review questions, which are on pages 995, 996, and complete the review sheets on 982 and 992. Now, the next section is really chapter 26, and I'm going to break that into two separate sections, the reproductive system for the male, then the reproductive system for the female. And have a great day.